Hello and welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast with me, Audrey Diaz. Hello and welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast, where we tackle the big issues facing businesses in the 21st century. And today I'm asking, should you compromise as a green entrepreneur to build your business? My guests today are Deniz Ucbasaran, Professor of Entrepreneurship here at Warwick Business School, and Hugh Thomas, CEO and co-founder of Ugly Drinks, a company which was launched 5 years ago to provide a healthy alternative to the soft drinks giants. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Brilliant. Well, it's really good to have you. And yes, of course, in an ideal scenario, we'd all be sitting across one another talking. But I suppose that's, again, some of the challenges that we've all been facing in this, well, the new normal world, as it were. Deniz, if I can start with you, why do green entrepreneurs get to a position where they have to choose whether to compromise?
Great question. Thank you, Audrey. So I think the challenge is not necessarily in the very early stages. It's when the business model is maybe a bit more defined and when the entrepreneurs know which kind of market they're entering. So what we've found is that in the very early stages, that kind of the passion, the values, the green values, propel many of these entrepreneurs to start their businesses because they want the business to be almost enactment of themselves or an extension of themselves. But I think in the very early stages, they tend to naturally gravitate towards those customers, those stakeholders who share similar values. So in the very early stages, it may be less problematic. I think the problems tend to arise if there are ambitions for growth. So if you want to go beyond that initial support, and then you're faced with customers or stakeholders who may not share those same values or who may not value the same things to the same degree. And that's possibly when there is a need for either compromise or for negotiation.
Hugh, taking what Deniz just said in terms of those values, can you take us through the philosophy of Ugly Drinks and explain to us if that philosophy has been challenged in bringing your product to market?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's some great points that Deniz made there. I think we started our business as obviously a real reason to start it, and certainly starting a drinks company, there's a lot of easier ways to make money, and I think we've always started not only with green values, but social values as well. The real mission behind our business was to tackle big soda and to give people an alternative to drinking sugary and sweetened beverages, which, cause all sorts of issues, whether it's diabetes, obesity, and other health issues globally. So that was kind of the real burning desire to start it, but I never wanted to start something that had a negative impact on the environment either. So we obviously start with those very core values, and I started this business having graduated from Warwick all those years ago now, but obviously with an ideal. And I think one of the things entrepreneurs need to get used to quickly is that the plan you start with is guaranteed to change. I think the Mike Tyson quote is everyone has their plan until they get punched in the face, and that is what being an entrepreneur is like. And certainly starting with an ideology, you're faced with lots of hurdles. And we use an example in terms of single-use plastic in our business. We initially started with the goal of having no single-use plastic anywhere in our supply chain. And then you realize that you're working with factories and co-packers who've been doing something for 50 years with a set of machinery that they have that is only able to do certain things in one way. And so you have to make these balanced decisions where the core vision in terms of getting a healthier beverage to people, you then have to make certain compromises on your way to improving. And now, as we're working and collaborating with those suppliers, we're reducing the single-use plastic almost towards zero. And that we're kind of working together. And I think that's one of my big learnings, is that idea of perfection takes time to work towards, and I had to let go of some of those very strict values in order for the business to actually create change. Change doesn't happen overnight. And I think as a young entrepreneur, I've had to learn that sometimes the hard way and compromise on that journey, which I think is what kind of Deniz was saying from a consumer point of view as well.
Is that something you agree with then, Deniz, with what Hughes just said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as human beings, as organizations, we are quite complex. So we often have multiple values, and it's a hierarchy or a constellation of those values, and that constellation can change. So in Hughes' case there, environmentalism was mentioned, but so was kind of care for others and health. So it might be that, health is the overriding consideration and the kind of the value there, with the aspiration for making sure that environmentalism is built into that. So I think we use the word compromise maybe somewhat negatively, but I often think of it's just rebalancing and finding an equilibrium over time.
I mean, how difficult was it, Hugh, if it was in some way, to try and adapt that plan? You said you went in with this ideal, but in terms of the adaptability, was that difficult at all?
Yeah, I think when you're first deciding you want to start a business, I think most entrepreneurs have a vision of what they want the future to look like. And so you sit there kind of with a blank sheet of paper and you're creating the future on that page. And I think quite often founders can be quite attached to that vision of the future. And in many ways, that's a good thing. But as Deniz says, compromise is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think it's a zigzag path towards the future. It's not a straight line. I'm sure everybody's seen that, the illustration of what startup life is actually like, and what it's nothing, no progress is a straight line in general. And so it's really setting that vision and having that North Star, and then understanding that sometimes you have to, maybe go one step back to go two steps forwards, or compromise or negotiate or be patient. And I've really had to practice those things on this journey. But when you actually take a step back on a 5-year scale and you zoom out, we've created a lot of change, and things that weren't possible a year ago have been able to be more possible as we've scaled, which is another one of the balances we've faced, is that some of those, say, environmental unlocks have come as we've become bigger and have more leverage with suppliers. So we've had to go through those pain points of growing in order to unlock the actual societal change we wanted to create. So that's been interesting. And I think there's another quote which, people overestimate what they can achieve in a year and underestimate what they can achieve in a decade. And sometimes you have to zoom out a little bit to create real change. And that took me time to learn. Certainly in my first year or two, I'm, an impatient person generally as an entrepreneur, but had to learn real patience and real kind of diligence. And certainly if you look at the last 12 months with coronavirus, some of the initiatives we had to be put on the back burner. Pretty much everyone we work with, internally and externally, has gone through some sort of seismic shift. So some of the things we had in our plan haven't been able to happen. And so you have to be patient and see it through. But having that North Star of the vision and being flexible around it has been the key.
Picking up on that, Deniz, how important is it to decide which areas you are prepared to compromise in, and those beliefs that are fundamentally, untouchable? Is it even possible to do that?
Another very good question. I think it is quite important. Recognizing what I said earlier, that some values may become more salient than others over time, but I do think it is quite important to have some untouchable values, simply because I found that one of the things that can kind of lead to problems with many entrepreneurs is a feeling of inauthenticity. And feeling inauthentic is just fundamentally not a nice place to be as an individual or in terms of your organization. So it is a long journey. It's a long journey of maybe even understanding yourself as a founder and who you are. But I think there are some things that maybe you need to be clear on, because if you're not, it's going to be very hard to persuade others to come on board and join you in that vision. So some of that is about, what you want to achieve, but some of it is, understanding some of the core values that you need to subscribe to get there, because entrepreneurship is very uncertain. So you still need some anchors or some certainty. And I think sometimes the values can represent that.
Hugh, were there any untouchable areas when it came to your business?
I think Denise sums it up really nicely there, in that, we do have those 2 or 3 core values that we've never shifted from. As much as I say we've kind of zigged and zagged, the North Star and the core values are things we pivot around, and there's some non-negotiables in our business. We will never add sugar or sweetener to our products, for example. We will never use a single-use plastic packaging format. In fact, we won't use plastic at all. So those things are core values. And then there's other human values internally that we also share in terms of cultural. Maybe some of them are, unwritten, and others we've kind of codified. But there's a determinism and a kind of a strength of passion that comes with our territory that, you have to have as part of our mission to be part of the team. But, we're always willing to learn as well. And so certainly over the last year or two, I've had to listen to the team as well, as the world changes too. And as, values of society and our employees change as well. And I think it's a constant learning process for me personally, where, certainly over the last year or so, I mean, there's so many issues that have been raised that are valid, and that maybe 10 years ago, as a society, we thought about differently, and we think much more progressively about now than we did then. And so I'm always trying to learn and question whether those core things are still valid or not, because I also have changed as a person too. And it's just, what they say, strong opinions loosely held. I think I try to subscribe to that on some of these things, whilst, knowing factually that sugar is bad, and I don't want people to drink it. That will never change. But some of the social things, making sure we have a diverse team with diverse opinions, and really understanding how we need to be the best organization we can, is something that does shift, and I'm always trying to improve and learn as a person and as a culture as well.
Yeah, you started in Ugly Drinks in the UK as a brand, and you took it to the US in 2018. Did that bring with it a fresh set of challenges?
Yeah, so I live in New York now. Obviously, one of the challenges I wasn't expecting was a pandemic, which has meant I've not been back home for 2 years at this point. But yeah, I mean, just moving to the US from the UK can seem daunting, and there is a whole set of challenges, from setting up a global supply chain, sales channels, everything down to employment legislation, tax, all the lovely stuff that we've had to learn and to get to grips with. And I think, again, a fresh set of compromises, as Denise says, that the markets are different, the consumers are different, but there are some non-negotiables that we knew were consistent between markets. We always set out to build a global brand with global values. And we knew that sugar, sweetener, and some of the social impact that we want to have is consistent with consumers, not only in these 2 markets, but hopefully more markets in the future as well. So the set of challenges has been vast, and it's a constant learning process on a daily basis. We've had to react to multiple challenges that some we expected and some that blindsided us. And I think it's one of the challenges of the entrepreneur is how you react to those things. Certainly the pandemic is an example, and weirdly, I feel like I was, as an entrepreneur, not as a human, I was prepared for that, because I deal with things like, the unexpected challenges on a weekly basis for the last 5 years. So of course there's a global pandemic. Of course that's something we have to navigate. It's just another thing on the list of challenges. So, but as a human, it's had a big impact on our, team as individuals and culture, and every stakeholder we work with. And so yes, moving to the US has been a challenge, but we've all had to face other challenges in the last 18 months in particular that we never expected.
Deniz, I know you mentioned there about going from the UK to the US. Now, obviously, there may be a common set of values, but what do you think of certain countries that may not share those values and cultures that are completely different? How difficult and how challenging does it become then?
I guess it is challenging, but one of the things about entrepreneurship and good entrepreneurs is that they need to engage in what I'd call a perspective taking. They need to understand the perspectives of others, whether that's investors, whether it's a different customer group that may have different values. So I think this is something that they have to apply in all aspects of the business. So yes, it will be challenging in that it will take time to learn, but if you're open to that idea of empathy and understanding the perspectives of others, and you're willing to try different things and experiment, which are what you would expect in the toolkit of any entrepreneur, I don't think they're unsurmountable. And it's an opportunity to learn something about the business and yourself.
Hugh, I mean, you put a lot of faith in social media for marketing. Does communicating directly with customers like that help maintain that philosophy of your product?
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things about social media as a small business is your ability to listen as much as anything, and it's created a one-to-one relationship with consumers that wasn't possible previously. And as a founder, I was that social media account, and I still am involved in the one-to-one communication with our consumers, and we've learned and listened to them. In fact, our most recent range of flavors launching in 11,000 stores in the US this month was inspired by what consumers were asking us for. And we would never have had that relationship with them without social media. And in a game where we're up against some of the world's biggest brands and biggest companies, it's in some ways leveled the playing field in terms of us meeting and interacting with consumers we would never have found. And then we've also been able to listen and learn from them. We are, brands are in essence owned by their consumers. And I think sometimes that's lost by big companies. And if you don't listen, you can't create the products that people want. And so we've had to adjust and learn and react, whilst again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, keeping some things that are non-negotiables. We've had to react to that, and social media made that possible. We don't have the budgets to sponsor, major football tournaments and the Olympics and TV commercials. So we have to find different ways to connect with people. And it's been incredibly valuable. And we have now a remotely distributed team across the world. And one thing connects us with our consumers wherever they are.
Deniz, what do you think of that? Interacting with your audience, as it were. How important do you think that is?
Oh, absolutely crucial. Entrepreneurs need to be good storytellers. So tell your story, staying true to those values and what you're trying to achieve. But the interaction with with whoever's supporting you is so important, because it almost shines a mirror on you as well. So you kind of get a sense of what's working, what isn't working as well. So absolutely getting people to commit to your idea requires investment and time, but very important and worthwhile, I'd say.
It's clear that the two of you really know, your subject, which is why we have you on here. But I'm going to ask you now for 5 recommendations that could help shed further light on this topic that we've been discussing today. So if I can start with you, Deniz.
So at the risk of sounding like a self-publicist, I want to start with a short article that summarises some of the work I've been doing in this area, just because it provides a little bit more detail. It's an article that can be found on the WBS website on the Core Insights section. And it summarises or introduces people to the idea of the authentic founder, and talks a little bit about some of the challenges of achieving that, how it's a really important source of motivation, but that it takes time to get there. But it's quite important. If you don't feel authentic, then you're likely to feel dissatisfied and demotivated, and that will affect the success of your business. So there we talk about ideas of authenticity, perspective taking, and kind of dissonance, and how that triggers change. But I think there's a couple of other articles that are connected, and they relate to the idea of pivoting. We've spoken about pivoting, and we know that pretty much all ventures will need to pivot at some point in time. And there's some work by a professor at University of Cambridge, Matthew Grimes, and in his article, which is called The Pivot, he talks about how entrepreneurs need to get feedback as they're kind of figuring out what their venture is about. But our ability to assimilate that feedback and make sense of it depends very much on how we define ourselves. And he found that there were three kinds of entrepreneurs. There were those that when they got feedback, if it was kind of contesting the idea or who they were, they would just try and defend that position. But the risk then is that you come across as somewhat stubborn. There are those who take on that feedback and are constantly trying to change the business, but then you're almost viewed as somewhat fickle. But the ones that seem to be most effective were those who sort of decoupled their founder role from who they were. So as a founder, there are certain things I may need to do, but as long as it's not compromising me as an individual, then I can make those changes. So I think that's quite useful in terms of figuring out how to pivot. The third paper, again, is about pivoting, but this is some work by Christian Hamill and colleagues. And they talk about the importance of bringing your stakeholders and your community on board when you have to pivot. So as I said earlier, in the very early stages, you might get a community of supporters. But if you then have to change the business and you're trying to get on board other people, don't forget about that original audience, because it can actually, they can react badly. So in their article, Christian Hamill and colleagues, they talk about the importance of kind of seeking empathy from that original community group, saying, well, we need to change the business because of X, Y, and Z. So they're trying to get empathy, but then also trying to convey the passion and the strengths of them as a team so that people have confidence that the business can pivot. The fourth thing, maybe a bit more suitable for a practitioner audience, you'll have heard of Simon Sinek's work on Start With Why, Find Your Why. So there's a collection of books there. And I think this is really useful because it forces you to articulate what those core values are, articulate what's the contribution you want to make to the world and what's your desired impact. So I think it just helps you figure out that North Star and those core values. And last but not least, I'd recommend a book by Noam Wasserman from Harvard Business School. It's a book called The Founder's Dilemmas. And I like this because founders do face dilemmas right from the onset, whether it's from, do I go on my own? Do I create a team? If I create a team, how do I reward them? What are some of the challenges in managing relationships? And I find it's based on solid evidence, but also these are genuine dilemmas that entrepreneurs face. One of them being, do I want to retain control, or do I want to relinquish some of that control in order to grow the business? Of course, that may come at a cost. So those would be my 5, which was very hard to settle on, I must admit.
And Hugh, your turn.
I've just written down everything Deniz has said, so I can populate my Amazon wish list in about 30 minutes. No, I just reiterate not that this is in my 5, but the Start With Why work by Simon Sinek is, there's a great YouTube, I think there's even a 5-minute version of his long TED talk, which is the basis of so many great brands, and I think that's worth a watch. For me, the number one recommendation or book I gift to any entrepreneurs is a book by Ryan Holiday called The Obstacle Is the Way, which is a book, I guess, that simplifies in some way, but in a very clever way, Stoicism. And, growing up, I always felt Stoicism was quite a grey, dour, stiff upper lip type thing. But, running a business, obstacles are going to come. It's inevitable that, something like, pandemic's a fantastic example of challenges coming your way that you don't expect. And I think the book, which I've read multiple times in hard moments, reminds you that many people across history, many people have encountered obstacles. And when they come, you have to, instead of panicking and throwing your hands up and saying, what can I do, and giving in, you have to see what the opportunity is. And the obstacle can quite often show the way. There are multiple examples at Ugly of times when an obstacle has come in our path that has then actually informed the pivot, as Deniz says, and actually created a better business. So we've either changed something in terms of product market fit, brand, culture, and almost like a judo move, using the weight of the opponent against you and using the weight of the challenge. And, every time something happens that, initially in that first moment as a human, you can be stressed and panic. I always try and center myself with the idea of the obstacle is the way, and how can we use this challenge to our advantage. And I think that covers everything across what we've discussed this morning. I've got several, there's so many books. There's not in any particular order to the next set, but I would say that's kind of one of the important things. What books? Another book that I like is The Hard Thing About the Hard Things by Ben Horowitz, of Anderson Horowitz. I think one of the things about entrepreneurship and being an early founder is that the media reinforces positive stories and success stories. And I think reading his book, it's just a very open, transparent view of his story as an entrepreneur and how he dealt in those difficult times. And he talks about a peacetime CEO and a wartime CEO. I think most CEOs in the world have been in wartime for 12 to 18 months right now. And I think it's a more realistic view of what being a CEO, an entrepreneur, or a founder is like, in that quite often there's a lot of hard things and they're really hard. And I think the book addresses that, and I always recommend that one too. Another, which I think is a little cliched, but Shoe Dog by Phil Knight of Nike is, for me, one of those books that you can look at the cover and think, oh, it's a book about Nike, and maybe get glamorized by what Nike is today. When I read that book, it resonated with me so much, because really it's a book about the early days before Nike. I say Nike now, I live in the US, by the way. Yeah. Before Nike is what it is now. And it's really the early days, and the days when he was selling shoes out of a boot of his car, struggling for cash, building his own family, and all the challenges revolving around that. And I just found it a fascinating read that just struck home with me in terms of the obstacles and the challenges and the real hustle it takes. And it's always reassuring to know that this huge mega brand now that we all see and all admire was actually started by, a few people selling Japanese sneakers on the West Coast out of their car with, cash that they were struggling to get together, and that it was on the brink of failure multiple times. And I always like reminding myself of that, because obviously we only see what we see today. I've got two more, and I won't take up too much time. The other is a book called The Energy Project by Tony Schwartz. I think one of the big things I've learned as a founder over the last 5 years is the importance of treating yourself almost like an athlete. And I think he's also written an article on, I think it's on Harvard Business Review Online, called The Corporate Athlete, which kind of reflects on the same things, but really finding your own personal balance when it comes to, physical, spiritual, mental kind of balance in life, and really understanding that you need to look after yourself like a sports car, right? You can't fuel a sports car with really cheap fuel. You have to feed yourself, you have to sleep properly, you have to look after yourself spiritually. You really have to manage yourself as if you're an athlete. And I think early on, I subscribed to that hustle culture of working long hours and burning myself out. And I've been to burnout and I've come out the other side now in a much healthier place where, I'm focusing on sleep, eating right, cutting back on drinking, all these things that really hamper your performance as a person. But what you don't realize, and what I'm still learning, is the words I say as a founder and CEO impact a lot of people. And if I'm off my game, or if I've slept badly, and the pressure comes, I'm not in the right place to deal with it. And that can affect people, it can affect the company. And so really managing yourself to make sure you have balance. And again, I think Deniz made a great point about disconnecting yourself sometimes from the company too is massively important. And then the last book I'll mention is The Magic of Thinking Big, which for me, again, cliched title, but being in the UK, I always dreamt of going bigger than I thought was possible. And I love that idea of kind of try and get to the stars and you'll land on the moon, or like the 10x thinking of, I think this is super cliched, but Elon Musk saying, what if you decided what you want to achieve in 10 years, what does it look like if you try and get there in 6 months? You'll probably fail, but you'll be a lot further on than if you tried to do it over 10 years. And I think it's not always great advice, but I do think quite often, things are possible that you might not believe. And this again sounds super spiritual, but you can will things into existence. If you want it enough, you can make anything happen. If you really believe in some of these values, certainly we go back to green entrepreneurship. If you really believe you can change it, you really can. And if you give yourself that power of thinking big, you can achieve anything you put your mind to. When I was in the UK in my bedroom starting the company, I knew we'd launch in America, and people said it wasn't possible, but because I subscribed to that thinking and that vision, we made it happen. Now we're sold across the country. Still might not work out, of course, right? There's so many obstacles coming, but I always love just giving people permission and that confidence to really dream big if they want to change the world. And again, I sound so cliched in some of these things, but for me, it was a really influential piece of reading.
Oh, that's a wealth of reading material there. But I know, and you've touched upon that already, and it's something I'm going to now round up this discussion with a very direct question, really. So can you keep your ideals and grow a business? Take it away, Hugh.
Yeah. Yes. And yes, you can 100%. And I think it's important that you have a set of values and a set of and a mission that you truly believe in from day one, and that when you're starting a business that you're not going, I want to make some money, because there's lots of ways to make money. And I think if you really want to build something with core values, you have to really spend time thinking about what they are. But then you also, as we've discussed, have to be willing to compromise and be aware that, it's not a 1-year journey. It's most likely a 10 to 20-year journey. And that's a zigzag. And there are some highs, there are some lows, there's things you have to compromise on. And I generally think in society in general, in politics and everything, people could, learn from compromise and long-term thinking. And I know we don't necessarily have a political system that values that. And so for me, that's what I've had to learn the hard way. And I think we could all benefit from being long-term thinkers with, core values at the heart.
What do you think, Deniz?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that's quite a measured and balanced response. It made me think of Guy Kawasaki, who's an investor and serial entrepreneur. He talks about making meaning. And there may be a variety of different ways that you can make meaning by staying true to some of those core values. So I would just like to say that the ideal, that dream, can be co-created by others, and it can evolve as long as some of those, untouchable values remain there. So I'd bring the two together.
There you go. So you can keep your ideals and grow a business. Well, that's all for today's episode of this podcast. Thanks to my guest, Deniz Ucbasaran, Professor of Entrepreneurship here at Warwick Business School, and Hugh Thomas, the CEO and founder of Ugly Drinks. I'll be back soon. For now, though, stay safe and goodbye.